Okay, everybody, welcome. Welcome. I think everybody's here now that we're expecting. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Annie Gunnar-Logan. I'm from the Coalition of Care and Support Providers, amongst other things, and I'm very grateful to Carnegie UK Trust who've asked me to come along and inject some semblance of order into this afternoon through the chair. So I'm very happy to do that. What I would like to start off by doing, we're going to have Julia speaking, who I'll introduce in a minute, and then we have an illustrious panel who will be giving you their thoughts. But I want to start with your thoughts. And I wondered if you could just take a couple of minutes to hook up with the person next to you and just have a quick chat about the last time that anybody in a public-facing role showed you some kindness. How did it make you feel? Just think back. Think back. How did it make you feel? Did it make you feel good? Did it irritate you? And only just afterwards you thought they were only trying to be kind? Just have a little think.
Well, I'll tell you mine.
Okay, everybody, I'm going to call you back to order, please. That was a very interesting little experiment there, because I just went and spoke to a couple of people. I should say this is being live streamed, so for the people who are watching on live stream, you have no idea what's going on. So we were just considering what kindness means to us in our personal interactions with people. So even just from a little tour of the room there, we were asking ourselves questions like, was that kindness, or was that just people being polite? Was that kindness, or was that people being appropriately professional? We had a little discussion up there about dentists and kindness in dentistry, what that might mean. So, and then over here we had a little memory just this morning of kindness extending to getting a hug. So some boundary issues going on here. So I don't know what that just told me going around was we're not entirely sure what we mean by kindness necessarily, but we kind of know it when we feel it. So that was just a little icebreaker to get you warmed up. What we're going to do now is we're going to hear from our main speaker, and that is the very wonderful Julia Unwin, who is currently free, free of organisational grip, having previously been Chief Executive of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and in fact is currently chairing the Commission into Civil Society for England. But for today's purposes, the hat that Julia is wearing is as a Carnegie Fellow. And we're looking at the Carnegie UK Trust work on kindness. So Julia is going to give us some, we hope, interesting, deep insight and potentially provocative comments on the matter of kindness in public policy. So Julia, I will give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you who've come to this very grim and, as we were saying, rather unkind room, but very nice to welcome you here. And thank you to Carnegie for giving me this opportunity to think these things through. It's a real privilege once you've no longer running an organisation, so you're not speaking on behalf of an organisation, to be allowed to think the unthinkable and say the unspeakable and know that you haven't got a whole lot of people back around going, oh, what's she saying now? Because I have a bit of a reputation for raising issues that people tend to go, really? Tracy Robbins, who worked with me at Joseph Rowntree Foundation, we were reminiscing when we started talking about loneliness, which I remember talking about at a conference in Edinburgh about 8 years ago. And there was a bit of an atmosphere in the room of, oh, what's she talking about now? We thought we were talking about social policy, and now talking about loneliness. She's going to talk about happiness next, kindness, love. You know, there are words that we use in our everyday language that we know matter to us. They matter to the people we care about, the people we love. And as soon as we become the public policy people we are, we go, oh, my goodness, that's a bit risky. And in talking about kindness, which I've been privileged to do for the last few months, I've noticed one of two reactions. There's the reaction that goes, yeah, of course, we ought to be kinder. We ought to be much nicer. It'd be so much better if communities talked to each other and neighbours were nice to each other. Or there's the reaction of, yeah, OK, fine, but I'm not coming to your event because actually it's not that interesting. It's not that radical. It's stating the obvious. It's not, as a colleague of mine on the panel was saying, it's not exactly controversial. What I want to say today is I think it's hugely controversial. I think it's really dangerous stuff we're talking about here. I think we're talking about changing quite a lot of our power structures, our ways of doing things, our ways of thinking of our fellow citizens. And anyone who thinks it's just a rather sweet thing to talk about probably ought to settle down now, because I'm going to say it reverses quite a lot of the things that we think really matter. And looking around the room and making some judgments, there are some people in this room who, like me, have been in and around public policy for a long time, and we've seen a lot of changes. And a lot of those changes came in for incredibly good reasons. But what I want to say today is we need to stop and think, have we given away more than we've gained in some of those changes? Because we know that kindness matters. We use the word kindness, and I tend to talk about humanity and love and other words. We use the word kindness because everybody receiving a service knows what it means. And I'm absolutely committed to only using the language that people themselves use. Everybody knows what it's like if somebody's kind. We all had examples when you asked us to talk about being kind, Danny. So we use the word, but it means a whole group of things about how we are in relationship to each other, how we deal with our fellow citizens, how we are to each other. And I think it matters for a number of reasons which are really current today, and they are big-ticket issues. It matters because we know that it's not just charities, it's the whole public service that is losing public trust and confidence at a rate. We know that people trust their local school, where they send their kids, partly because if they didn't, they'd have to do something about it, but all the polls tell us that. They probably trust their GP, but they're not quite sure. But the further the services get away from them, the more institutional they are, the less they trust them. And we know that's incredibly bad for outcomes. If you don't trust the consultant at the hospital you go to for a long and intractable illness, you are much less likely to get good outcomes. It really matters. This is not a nice to have. It matters for public trust and confidence. It matters because our demographic change means the demands on our public service are going to grow. Forget austerity, even if austerity had never been a dream in George Osborne's eyes and never a word that we'd learnt to spell. The numbers of people who are ageing, fantastic result. The numbers of people with disabilities, fantastic result. The numbers of people with long and profound medical conditions, all going up, all a great result, all putting big pressure on our public services. If we don't engage with kindness, we would just be providing those people with a warehousing sort of service. So it matters for our outcomes. And it finally matters because the big thing that all public policy people, government, charities, all of us want, is much less about what we do to people, but it's how people change their behaviour. Think of the big challenges around us. Violence in the city of Glasgow. Big changes of behaviour were required to deliver a fantastic result that's been delivered. Childhood obesity. Big behavioural changes are required if we're going to meet that huge challenge. Saving carbon and protecting our planet. Big behaviour changes. We can't talk about making those big behavioural changes unless we have a really acute emotional intelligence that understands what it is that motivates people, that pays what I've called exquisite attention to what really gets people moving. And that's the root of kindness. So for me, this is not a lecture. This is not talking from some high place, but we ought to be kinder to each other. This is absolutely mission critical for the future of our country, that we find a way of engaging with our fellow citizens that is not simply transactional. You go to work and you might get your benefits sanctioned. I know you're not doing that in Scotland, but we are in the rest of the UK. You come to the hospital and I'll tell you what to do. We require a different set of relationships. And that's why I'm interested in this really subversive stuff called kindness. Now, there is a third reaction. I talked about the first two that you get, a sort of shrugging of the shoulders, or please don't talk to me. And the third is, oh yes, the Daily Mail reaction. Back in the day, before there was all this regulation, before we had professionals, everyone was nice to each other. I will not accept that sort of nostalgia. Dreadful things happened before the welfare state. Dreadful, dreadful things happened because we had a failure of regulation. Dreadful things are still happening because despite all of our rules and regulations, there are people, and I'm going to say it because I'm trying to be controversial, men in many of our institutions who have behaved incredibly badly and done really wicked things. And that's true of charities, it's true of public services, it's true of hospitals, it's true of some of our longest serving established institutions. So there isn't a golden age when this was all fine. But there have been changes that many of us have witnessed, and I just want to enumerate a few of them. The introduction of new efficiencies and different forms of management into the public services was well overdue. And in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, the new public management gained traction. And we all got good at measuring outcomes and associating outputs, worrying about inputs, worrying about outcomes, worrying about how we accounted for things. And actually, those of us spending money that the public, either through taxation or through gift, gives us, ought to account for how we spend that money. But it had a big effect on how our services were run. And it reduced some things that we know are about a relationship, about the way in which people change their lives, about the really tough stuff of how we deal with those we love. Change that into an outcome or an output. And that's not the way in which people's relationships work. And that's what I mean by the transactional approach of new public management. It assumed you could put a price on everything. And it was followed very quickly by the new public audit. You could measure everything. And we found ourselves measuring some fairly ridiculous things. In the 80s, I was running services for homeless people in London, where we started to be required to measure every single thing that happened to homeless people, until I discovered that many of the hostels I was responsible for were ticking the form moved to permanent accommodation for everybody who went to prison. I know why they were doing it. We wanted to move lots of people to permanent accommodation. They were in permanent accommodation. It was not the desirable outcome. We all gamed the system. We all know about that, and we can all have our own stories and anecdotes. But the new public audit, which was needed because the public need to have trust in how we spend our money, I'm not disputing that, led us to some very dangerous places where we thought what was worth doing could be measured, and unless you could measure it, it wasn't worth doing. We moved, I think, in response to a lot of crisis, in response to a lot of difficulties, to a whole range of processes and procedures which are now bred in the bone of everybody in this room. Who can't rehearse all the issues about boundaries? Who can't talk about the ways in which regulation has changed and protected? And who can't remember why those rules were brought in? Every one of them brought in for a good reason. Bad stuff happens, we create rules to stop it happening. So a whole lot of processes and systems have grown on top of each other in a climate in which our emotional intelligence collectively as a society is pretty feeble, really. We're not just scared of using the words love, friendship, loneliness, kindness. We don't even take it into account when we look at some of our biggest social problems. Now, a piece of work that was done a few years ago in Glasgow, which I have heard so much about and I've heard discussed in terms of addressing violence among young people, and specifically among young men in this city, has been transformative precisely because it was rooted in a form of emotional intelligence. I don't live in this city. My accent tells you I don't come from this country, but I have heard that described in ways that give an absolute beacon to the rest of the UK in thinking deeply and profoundly about what motivates people. Why do they do things? It's a sight more intelligent than the English ASBOs, which are offered to the parents of children who are behaving badly, without any understanding of what life is like in terms of the relationships within a household. When we talk about emotional intelligence, it's very quick. When we talk about emotional intelligence and about kindness, we very quickly go to the front line of public services. And I want to go far away from the front line. I think the vast majority of care assistants, people working in hospitals, people working in social care, are absolutely motivated by kindness. Lord knows they could earn a better crust doing something else. I'm talking about the kindness of architects and urban planners. What about those housing estates which look as if they've been designed to make sure that you won't ever catch your neighbour's eye when you come out of the door? We've all been to those. What about the road traffic systems that make it incredibly difficult for people to get from one side of a neighbourhood to another? What about the people who collect our rents, if you're in social housing, the people who collect council tax? I've forgotten the Scottish word for council tax, forgive me. Collect the local tax. Local taxation.
It's the same.
It's called that as well, thank you. I just didn't want to move into English when I shouldn't have. Thank you. What about the people who are designing the systems? What about the people who are planning for the future of our services? I'm addressing my discussion about kindness to those people, which is why we talk about the power of kindness. It's not just the practice of it. It's the policymakers, the designers, the people who have allocative responsibility, the people who have coercive control, are all people who are motivated to go into public service not because they are bad people, but for whom the regulations, the rules, the processes, the culture of organisations can make that ability to show kindness, to show warmth, to show humanity really strangled. There are huge risks with this conversation. There are huge risks that allowing the sort of autonomy and discretion that I'm talking about creates extremely unfair services. We all know that once you respond to a human being in a human way, the outcomes might be better. But you're more likely to do that with somebody who you have something in common with. We all know that in our own lives. That is the root of discrimination. And the reason I say talking about kindness is dangerous is because you're also talking about discretion, autonomy, and you risk that sort of discrimination. We all know that the regulations about boundaries, about how you behave with clients, about how you respond, have been set up for good reasons to stop bad stuff happening. We don't want to unravel that, but we want to free people to have the sort of human relationships that most of us would like to have when we go and see our GP. Most of us want to be talked to as a human being with rights and responsibilities. That's why this takes us into the really tricky territory of emotional intelligence and how it relates to how we design services, how it relates to how we predict difficulties. Now, I'm going to come up with a few examples, and these are coming from all over the UK, so bear with me. We have in England suffered an absolute crisis in many of our towns because of the child sexual exploitation cases, the cases in which young women taken into care in all our names, because they're in public care, so they're in our names, they're our kids, were raped and abused by groups of men. This has riven the local authorities of Rotherham, Rochdale, Bradford, all sorts of difficult, poor towns, absolutely upended them and transformed what they do, and made it extraordinarily difficult to manage, because it hasn't just been about childcare, it's also about who was licensing the taxi companies. It was also about who was running the pubs where some of these dreadful things happened. Emotional intelligence might have alerted us earlier. We might have had a different way of seeing what was happening to young, vulnerable women in our care. I think we didn't, because we find it so hard to speak of those unspeakable things. We don't want to address it. In London, we had the tragedy of Grenfell Tower, which has transformed English, I was going to say English housing policy, I wish, the debate about English housing policy, that's all it's transformed so far. If we'd had both the emotional and the local intelligence to understand what was happening there, if we'd admitted that in England many, many tower blocks now have multiple landlords in them because the right to buy has created that, we would have intervened to stop that happening. But we closed our eyes to it because it was just too difficult. That's why emotional intelligence matters. Being really close to communities and understanding what does it mean that in this tower block you have absentee landlords running one bit of it, private sector landlords running another, a few homeowners, a few squatters, a few illegal immigrants there. What does it mean if you have that sort of grouping? And the third big issue where I can see this issue of emotional intelligence coming up is about violence, which is why I talked about Glasgow. We know that we are facing real crises of violence in many places. And yet the prescriptions given are about policing, and many of the police are doing extraordinary good things. We are overcrowding our prisons, and we know we are creating more violent people through that because we find it too difficult to think about what might be. Crisis in masculinity might be one of the issues that we're looking at. Gross inequality in some of our areas, looking closely at what really drives this. And in closing, why does this matter? Emotional intelligence, kindness, however we describe it, it matters massively because of those big issues which we need to address. But it matters so much more now because we are moving into a world which is going to be transformed by artificial intelligence and technological advance. Think back to the days before you had a computer in your pocket, because I guarantee most people in this room have got a working computer in your pocket. I guarantee that people are following us on Twitter, and there's probably some abuse coming my way already. I guarantee that our world has changed because already what we have experienced with social media. We know already the algorithm is driving what gets sold to us, what gets marketed to us. We know it is coming into public policy, again, like regulation, like an argument about boundaries, like an argument about outcomes, for good reasons. Why would you not put your money and your services where the algorithm tells you it will work best? But that doesn't take us to incredibly kind and responsive and human-shaped processes. That can take us, unless we take control of it, to a very scary world of artificial intelligence, which is already being used to predict some things, predicting service levels. We have huge technical capability of a sort that could liberate us in the way that maybe our smartphones have. But it can also take us to a place where people are getting some very cold, very distant, and not very trusted services. And that seems to me to be a really dangerous step for us to take. That's why I think Carnegie are really right to focus on this issue of kindness, because I think it speaks to our well-being, not now, although this is really urgent, but in the very near future, where we could be in a place where we are in real danger of losing touch with what makes most of us human. Thank you very much.
Fantastic input from Julia there. Thank you so much. We're going to open up to some discussion with the panel and with yourselves. Just a couple of reflections from me. I think the way that Julia is talking about kindness in the power structures rather than in the individual frontline relations is absolutely critical to this. I mean, I'll give you an example from my own field of work, where we had an authority that caused the most massive disruption to the lives of people whose lives are already quite challenging by transferring their service from this organisation to that organisation. And the reason why they did it was, and I quote, to protect the integrity of their framework contract. It really wasn't anything to do with those people. It was done at their expense rather than for their benefit. And it was just, as you were talking there, Julia, that was something that kind of popped into my head about that. I think it's very, very important reflections being made there about the way in which your impulse to kindness can follow your personal set of preferences. And I've worked in organisations, and I'm sure you have, where we invest a lot in something called unconscious bias training. But kindness can often be a form of unconscious bias. And I thought the original Carnegie report that Zoe, where's Zoe? That Zoe wrote for us was quite illuminating about that, because she was talking about volunteers who had a kindness impulse towards people who may look a bit more like them than other people. And that's kind of what happens. So the other reflection I'd give you is just to start off with is, again, in the care field, a lot of the debate at the moment is about the imperative for reducing the amount of paid support that we give to people because it costs a lot of money. So what can we replace that with? And can we replace it with community supports or natural supports? You know, there seems to be an illusion that there's a sort of great mass of unpaid carers all just waiting like coiled springs ready to come and support you. And then the last point that Julia made about, you know, the artificial intelligence and particularly kind of tech solutions to supporting people, we haven't really gone anywhere near this yet, in my view. So I'm going to introduce the panel to you in a wee minute, but first of all, you can see who they are. I'll introduce them. Just want to take some reflections from one or two people in the hall, if I can. Is this one on? Yep. Okay. So, hello. What would you like to say? Who are you, and what would you like to say?
My name is Kat. I work for the DOT project. We essentially take an empathetic approach to tech development. But I was wanting to ask something a bit more individual. I think I'm going to share a bit of a personal kind of context, if that's okay.
You do it fairly rapidly.
I will. My husband is in the army, and he comes from a system which is very patriarchal. And I feel like it's really important to keep people who work in those types of environments make sure that they understand what the wider world is like. And actually, I find it very exhausting. Recently, he turned to me and he said that he's actually going to go on a gender advisory course, which is really fab. But I see that this is something that's needed like across a system. And what is your advice to kind of harnessing the power of people at an individual level to actually make the changes that are necessary, those changes that will lead to the power of kindness, not just being kind, but like systematic changes. Sorry.
Very important. No, thank you for that. Hold that thought, Julia, because I'll get you to respond to that if you would. Any other immediate comments from the room?
Answers on a postcard.
Oh, right at the beginning. Right. No, back to you, sir. I beg your pardon. Yes. Would you like to just say who you are, first of all?
Yeah, I'm Kevin Hutchins. I'm from Langstone Housing Association. I was interested to hear the comments about people who collected arrears and so on, because I think it's an act of kindness to actually intervene early to try to ensure that people do pay their rent, and in doing that actually offer kindness to helping people access food vouchers and food banks. And I know the courts actually require that, but at the end of the day, that is something that we see as a priority, and we actually take reports on, and we like to see happening. We would wish that more people would actually voluntarily actually approach us as a housing association for help on that.
So the kindness is not in overlooking things when they're going wrong, and so we won't bother that person with that. Yes. Let me take one more comment, and then we'll come to the panel. So who are you? What's your name and where you come from?
I'm Neil Finn, University of Edinburgh. Julia, thanks very much for that. I think you knew you were sailing close to the wind, making a few comments about blokes there being unkind. I guess it was a strategy to make sure that the few blokes in the room said some stuff. So I'll say some stuff. I haven't trolled you. I haven't trolled you on Twitter, but just, I mean, you're absolutely right. In order to fight for kindness, you have to call out unkindness and you have to call out bad behaviour. But please, let's not make this into a gender war. Blokes are perfectly capable of being kind. Women are perfectly capable of being very, very unkind, and we have to recognise that on both sides.
I completely agree with that.
Julia, do you want to? You've got an immediate reaction there, but would you like to just comment on the other colleagues who made a point, and then we'll move on to the panel?
Yeah, I'm going to be very brief on all of them. Absolutely. I mean, the reason I talked about people collecting rent or collecting any sort of charge is that one of the risks we face is that by making things, for example, more mechanical, the number of housing associations I now know who use call centres rather than people to encourage people to collect rent is actually increasing rent arrears, and that's the most unkind thing you can do. It's incredibly important that we have a human relationship which understands why people do things. So absolutely. The second question about harnessing the power of people, social change only happens because of the relationship between two people. That's how all change happens, and we've got to find new and imaginative ways. And I really hope I wasn't as rude as you suggest I was. All I was referring to was that some of the big scandals recently have been discussed as if it's a huge institutional failure, which it is, and it hasn't necessarily concentrated on some of the people who caused that. But there are horrible women around too, and I could be one of them.
And I shall be one if the speakers run over time. So let me introduce the panel, the rest of the panel, to you. Nearest to me here we have Adele Harris, who is the Chief Executive of Cornerstone. Started off in the northeast, but now very much right across Scotland. Cornerstone, I declare an interest here. It's a CCPS member and a major provider of care and support services to people in Scotland. Next to Adele, we have Stephen Gallagher from the Scottish Government, who is how long in post now, Stephen, is this in this guise?
4 months.
4 months into post as the Director for Local Government and Communities. So obviously for a third sector audience, local government is a very key partner, and I use that word advisedly for us. And the communities and the community empowerment aspect of all of this, I think, is very, very significant. And then next to Stephen, we have Sarah Van Putten, who is the Chief Executive of Befriending Networks, an organisation whose relationship to kindness probably speaks for itself.
Well,
I would think the clue is in the title when it comes to Befriending Networks. So, Sarah, can I ask you to kick off first with some thoughts? Now, if you have something you want to come back on, just stick your hand up, because I'll be looking around, and then we'll, rather than just have kind of people one after the other, if you want to interject, please do, but just stick your hand up. Sarah.
Okay, thank you very much. I suppose I'm going to respond to this both as a professional who's worked in the care sector for a large number of years now, and not necessarily always sharing Befriending Networks' point of view. I suppose I'd like to say that, because some of the things I'm going to say talk about me as a professional necessarily rather than Befriending Networks, but at points I will talk about the befriending sector. First of all, thank you very much to both the Carnegie Trust and Julia for the really interesting work. I think it's really insightful, and it certainly made me think in the recent reports that I've read and in preparation for today. It's made me think really hard about the direction of travel that we've all taken And I think as professionals, we probably without thinking, I certainly know that I have, been swept along with that belief that professionalism, regulation, transparency, and that fantastic phrase, evidence-based interventions, would somehow help us arrive at the end point where as a society in Scotland we truly cared for everybody in our population and helped the most vulnerable. And I think we probably all naively did that, absolutely with the right intentions, but actually have we got there? And I'm thinking back on my 30 years or so now within the care sector, I definitely think we've lost something along the way. The intentions were right, and Julia's absolutely right when she says not everything was perfect way back then, because it wasn't. But we have lost something along the way. And in some way, I think we as a third sector potentially have lost most. I would certainly question, and I've chosen for the majority of my working career, originally from the statutory sector, but for most of it to work in the third sector for good reason. The third sector has a USP, or used to have a USP, that meant we were a bit different from the public sector. Our values were a bit different. We were allowed to be more flexible, more responsive, more person-centred. And in our drive to meet funding requirements, to meet regulations, have we lost that USP in the third sector? I don't necessarily have an answer to that, but I suppose it's a question I'm posing to you to really think about. Have we lost something that we used to have as a third sector because we've been driven along to be more professional, to be more transparent, to meet funding requirements, to prove evidence, to measure outcomes? So there's one thought to leave with you. Also, Julie, in her presentation and the paper that we had to read before today mentions the word love. How comfortable as a care professional do I feel in thinking about that word love when I think about some of the people that I've worked with over the years? Did I develop a loving relationship with them? Should I have developed a loving relationship with them? Certainly lots of the people that I've supported over the years have touched my heart, and they've changed me as a person. And I would like to think that through my connections with them, I've probably touched their hearts and changed them too. And shouldn't we as a sector be able to celebrate that and think that that's okay? I think we should. For some of the most vulnerable in society, their befrienders, from Befriending Network's point of view, or their care staff, are those that spend the best and worst times with them. They are their human connection. Therefore, those things are vital. This brings me nicely onto the wonderful world of boundaries, a word that keeps people safe. And in lots of cases, it absolutely does. But I was massively surprised when I returned to befriending, having been a befriender 28 years ago, just how many boundaries we at Befriending Networks advocate for. Don't give out volunteer phone numbers to befriendees. Only visit for your times and you've got to go away at those times. Oh no, we can't exchange presents. Oh, invitations to birthday parties, Christmas events. That could be a bit scary. Are these really necessary? Well, as Julia says, sometimes things have been set up in response to things going wrong. Sometimes they are necessary. But I've got a bit of a challenge for the befriending organisations in the room, and I know there are a few today. Are they all really necessary? Could we consider being part of the Carnegie Trust Kindness Innovation Network? Could we really think about questioning some of them? Because I personally believe in the befriending sector, we should be questioning them. We know in befriending that the relationship is the most important thing that makes the difference. So could we lead the way in helping the public sector really think about relationships and care? I think we could. Moving on slightly to slightly different public policy and thinking about self-directed support in Scotland. A public policy brought about to give people personal budgets and to allow them to have more control over their care. Well, last month when I got my salary, I didn't instantly think of the outcomes I was going to achieve with that or the impact I was going to make. I spent it, and it bought me an odd bottle of wine, cinema trips, and probably the occasional junk food that didn't meet my health requirements, but I did it anyway. Yet our public policy expects people to get their self-directed support budgets to be able to justify their outcomes and the impact before they're approved. The last point I'd like to pick out is more around evidence. I truly believe that we as a third sector are still the best place to help public policy really think about evidence and what matters. As the third sector, we are really great at being able to gather those personal reflections and stories. I believe that as a third sector, we should be able to help the public sector think about those personal and emotive feelings that we gather in our case studies. Very recently, earlier this week, one of the workers at Befriending Networks was telling me about an evaluation that she's been carrying out. And she almost cried as she read to me one of the quotes. It simply said, "Thank you for helping to save my life. Thank you for caring enough to bother." Is that not evidence enough that sometimes money's well spent? I think it should be. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. A couple of things. What you're talking about, have we lost something from the voluntary sector? I mean, there's a body of academic research here that will tell you that we are suffering from something called isomorphism, which is that where we begin to resemble the organisations from which we get our funding, because that's what they expect us to do. I mean, when I first started in the voluntary sector, we didn't have chief executives, we had directors. I've resisted so far. I know some of you haven't, but it's okay. But you know, we start to kind of take on all the new public management attributes of the organisations that fund us. So there's a new one for you if you haven't heard that one before, isomorphism. The thing about love is really important. This is a huge issue now if you're working with looked after children. You'll know that this debate has been running for a while, and this is very, very current. You know, is that what professionals are expected to demonstrate to the young people whose care they're entrusted with? And you know that it's not as straightforward as you might imagine. In adult social care, we now have a set of health and social care standards that talk about compassion rather than love, and that's actually something which is subject to regulatory inspection. I'm exaggerating for effect here, because clearly that's not something you can measure in a kind of traditional way. But if it's in the health and care standards, and there is a care inspectorate that will have a counter, there's a huge challenge for all of us in what that actually means in practice. And the boundaries, yes, absolutely. And just to kind of refer back to Zoe's report, I was very struck in Zoe's Carnegie report for Carnegie about kindness that some people liked volunteering because there was a bit of a Chinese wall between them and the people they were supporting, and they would not actually exhibit that behaviour with the people next door because the personal risk of getting sucked into something was too great, and they were, you know, it gave them a bit of distance to be part of an organisational impulse towards kindness rather than a kind of an entirely individual and personal one. So I think that's kind of the boundary issue comes up there too. Any immediate thoughts on what Sarah's heard? We'll just have a couple and then we'll move to our next panels. I should say, by the way, we started 10 minutes late, so we'll probably finish. If you need to leave, you need to leave. We'll not put tripwires up. You'll be all right. So, who are you?
My name's Alison Bunce, and I run Compassionate Inverclyde down in Greenock. And and I really believe that the success so far of this project, with both No One Dies Alone and the Community Act of Kindness through back home boxes, has been the lack of rules and regulations. And it is easy that ordinary people are helping ordinary people, and there's not bureaucracy that ties up. You know, it's a long process to become part of that programme. Obviously, with the No One Dies Alone, somebody's sitting with a vulnerable person in a room, and yes, they have PVG checks and interviews and references, but to go up to Inverclyde Royal and help out pack a back home box and deliver it to a ward, you can go up and come along and go up and deliver that, because it's safe to do that, and there's not a whole pile of bureaucracy or framework or policy that stops that. And I've got probably about 110 volunteers within a year. And we don't call them volunteers, they're helpers or companions, but I truly believe that it's reducing risk to the minimum, but also providing an opportunity that's easy to buy into.
It's sometimes a fine line to tread, isn't it? Yep. We had another comment here, and then we'll move on. So, who are you?
Hi, I'm Tracy Robbins from the Eden Project. So I did the loneliness work with Julia many years ago. So I just wanted to say something about evidence-based, because I think that's really interesting. So I used to have quite a few debates about what evidence is. And for me, evidence is experience. And I think a lot of people think evidence-based is what you can research and academic research. And they're very different beasts. And I can remember being told when we were talking about nothing about us without us, from a high accoladed researcher saying, well, you can't have people in poverty stealing the poverty agenda, you know, in case the research mismatched what people's experience were. So you must look at that evidence is actually experience. And I think love is a huge thing. The most of the work I do, which is now in the informal sphere, trying to get neighbours to knock on their neighbours' doors with the big lunch and things like that. And I think that's where we need that human response, where we're so protective of our personal space now that we're fearful of opening our doors. And I just think there's something about that love of people and not things. So people get scared to use love because I've just given this young man a hug. And I can because I'm a woman, and I'm very safe positioned to do that. So you have to take advantages of being a woman sometimes. So I just think there's key things about the informal sphere. As soon as we create a safety net service, and we need them, I mean, there's some terrible situations, but as soon as you do, you put the boundaries in place, and we all have a responsibility of human beings, professionals and people in our communities to make sure we practice what we preach and improve that informal layer so we need less services because that human contact's there.
Thank you, Tracy. The personal space thing's really interesting. I mean, people will have realised that I'm not from around here either originally. And I still have my pal who comes up from London, and he has a heart attack every time that people say thank you very much to the bus driver. He's like, really? 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 You do that here? Yeah, we do that here. Okay, we're going to pass on to Stephen. You don't mind coming last, do you, Adele?
No, there'll be nothing left to say, but that's okay.
We're going to pass on to Stephen. Stephen, I introduced before, who's Director of Local Government and Communities at the Scottish Government. Your 5 minutes starts now.
Thank you, Annie. My background is currently Senior Civil Servant Director for Local Government and Communities, responsible for local government, public service reform, community empowerment, and a whole load of other things, okay? But prior to that, I had worked in the NHS as a Director of an NHS Trust and then NHS Performance Lead for Scotland as part of the government. And I can't remember, as I ran about in my new public management mode, chasing waiting time targets, that I deployed love as one of my assets. I'm not even sure I employed kindness, to be quite honest with you, and I'm not sure that the management ethos of those days required me or even encouraged me to do so. And I think I make that point to say that kindness hitherto, or any substitution, hasn't really been an acceptable language or a recognised language in a lot of our system leadership. Now, I mentioned that I was responsible for public service reform. So in Scotland, for many of you, you will think back to the Christie Commission report of 2011. I don't expect you to have read every page of it. That would be unkind. But what perhaps you will remember from it are that there are four kind of central tenets, four pillars of public service reform. There's partnership working, seeing the system, prevention, so really trying to address the root cause of issues and not the symptoms, people, both in a people-centred way in terms of the delivery of service, but also how to mobilise the public service workforce, and performance, focused on outcomes and with a bent to efficiency and effectiveness. So I guess we've been on a journey in Scotland since 2011 around implementing the Christie Commission recipe and trying to take it forward, and we've been learning as we go and reflecting on some of the provocations, and kindness is one such provocation. So if we really believe that partnership working is important, I think we've evolved our thinking from partnership between large public organisations to thinking much more about systems and the kinds of equal partnerships which need to exist between the traditional public service players and civic society, those in communities, the third sector, business. We need to think much more unconventionally around what partnership working actually means. So I think we've moved our thinking there. But if we really want to explore the value of working in systems, I would say, how could we do that without embracing systems in an open-minded and open-hearted way? And surely that speaks to an approach embodied with kindness. And on prevention, if we're actually to get to the root cause of the problems and needs of individuals, as Julia said, to pay exquisite attention to the needs of individuals, if we're to truly do that, how can we do it without building trust? And how can we build trust without being kind. And on people. So where we see people as assets and we do not judge, and our move in government to establish the new Social Security Agency is based on the twin pillars of dignity and respect. And I think that is a novel approach to creating a social security system. But how can we make sure that our staff are empowered to resolve issues and not just slavishly follow the leanest possible approach? And Julia's also right. Some of these approaches, some of this freedom, some of this empowerment will create dilemmas, will create tricky ethical dilemmas in different professions. But how come a number of organisations are now empowering staff and achieving remarkable results? Here in Scotland earlier this year, Julia chaired a round table and we were privileged to speak to members of the Wheatley Group in Glasgow, who can evidence going beyond a lean approach to staff empowerment, real staff empowerment, and actually an improvement in the results. And that takes me to the performance question on values and behaviour. I don't think we can look at kindness and look for a particular performance index as a straight line to necessarily change. I think it's about values and behaviours, it's not about process. It's not easy to measure at the point of delivery, and it's probably never a standalone feature. For me, it's probably more of an ingredient of an increasingly understood recipe as to what makes a difference and how to reform services. And the other components of that recipe, to think the system and think about who is part of that system in an unconventional way, to focus on outcomes, to co-produce services and to think about assets, not deficits, to deploy collective leadership of systems rather than hierarchical leadership, to empower staff and to imbue in all of our public services and our change efforts strong values, treating people with dignity, respect, and dare I say, kindness. And for everyone in this room, I've worked also in the third sector as a chair of a housing and care organisation and the board member of an addictions charity. It seems to me that what we speak of in terms of community empowerment and your agility to respond to situations, often much more quickly and directly and relationally than big public service organisations, then this message of kindness speaks often to where you come from, but what you are capable of and capable of doing at pace. And the challenge to public services is more fundamental. And next month in the Scottish Government, as officials, we will welcome Julia back to give us some provocation as to how we can think more clearly about kindness, not at the point of delivery, but at the point of policy, point of policy creation. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I see some hands going up. Hold that thought, because I'm going to give the floor to Adele first of all, and then we'll come out and get some comments from Ashili. I will come to you. Don't worry. First mention, I think, there of staff empowerment, you know, in the sense that kindness is not something that can be instructed. I think there's a real link here with what is happening in the care sector around values-based recruitment. You know, it's not just about whether you've got an SVQ. It's what are you bringing to this job? What is it about you personally that's going to make you a good fit? I mean, that's the kind of thing that's happening in care. I think you're talking about that more broadly, Stephen, but that's exactly where we're going with this agenda, I think. And ending with a bit of a vote of confidence in our sector. For all that Sarah thinks we've lost a bit, we haven't lost it all, clearly,
Nope,
because we are very much still seen by colleagues in government, I think, as the way into some of this. I mean, my slightly barbed comment about that was, you know, let's put your money where your mouth is then, and let's actually open the doors for third sector more, because we do have an awful lot of barriers in our way when it comes to partnership working still. So, Adele, let's have your thoughts, and then we'll come out to the folk who had their... As I said before, if you do need to leave, that's fine, because we are running a wee bit over the time, but I hope you'll stay. Adele.
Thank you. I won't take it personally if you all start to put your coats on. Goodness, this when I was invited to join the panel today, And I had already engaged with the report that Zoe and the Carnegie UK Trust had produced on kindness. And as has already been said, really thought-provoking stuff. In some ways, you could say a lot of it is common sense. And I said to Julia beforehand, what is controversial about kindness and being kind? But there's so many different layers to this. And so I really welcome the establishment of the Kindness Innovation Network and the continued work in this area. At Cornerstone at the moment, we are either bravely or stupidly, depending on how well this goes, introducing quite a radical new model of social care delivery with the very ambitious aim of transforming the social care sector in the UK. And a lot of the comments from the panel and from the audience so far have resonated very much with what we're doing and why we're doing it. And without going into all the details of the model that we call Local Cornerstone, it is based fundamentally on trust and empowerment, genuinely trusting and empowering people in our local communities to do the right thing. And most of us in the room will work for a third sector organisation, and we will have a very clearly defined charitable purpose. And at the essence of our new business model is, if you always have the charitable purpose at the forefront of your mind and you act within that charitable purpose, then do we really need all the layers of bureaucracy and policies and procedures and managers and supervision and competency-based recruitment, and I could go on, when we ultimately should trust that the people who are delivering the care and support in their local community are delivering it well. And of course there's huge risks and dangers, and we've talked about some of those already in terms of boundaries and so on. But unless you wholeheartedly go into this, it's not going to work. You've got to trust that people will be kind and they'll do the right thing. I looked up the definition of kindness in the dictionary just to check I was on the right wavelength this morning. And it's the quality of being friendly, generous and considerate. And then there is a sub-definition, which is kindness is acting without the expectation of receiving anything in return or any recognition for your kindness. And I guess I just leave that hovering really, because quite often when people are kind to us, particularly in a professional setting, we're left with this feeling, what's in it for them? What do they want to get out of it? And it's so saddened me really when I had that thought this morning. And we've talked already this morning about values, and again, I'm sure all of us in this room work for an organisation that has values. And I wondered how many of us have the word kindness within either our charitable purpose or within our values. Cornerstone, we have 4, and one is caring. I care about the people we support and my colleagues, which is, I guess, close to kindness. But it did get me thinking about values being more than just what's on the staff room wall on a poster, and making sure that as organisations in the third sector, we really live and role model those great values. So what gets in the way of us being kind at work? Some of this has already been touched on. But on my list, I had over-professionalisation, because fundamentally, in the context of delivering social care, it's about a relationship between two people. And of course, as everyone has already said, regulation and protection and all the things we've talked about, co-production and personalisation and self-directed support, these all have a place. I'm not suggesting we throw them away. But have we really over-professionalised what is in essence a relationship between two people, sometimes the most intimate of relationships? We've talked about policies and procedures, and as part of our new local cornerstone model, we've reduced the number of policies we have as an organisation. We had 118 different policies and procedures. And in HR terms, we had 52. We've reduced them to 7, and they're all on one sheet of paper. Because our fear, I think, of doing wrong or doing the wrong thing or being blamed for something, we have created this whole system where we don't trust someone to know what to do instinctively. We have to write a policy about it. Competency-based recruitment and appraisal, we've all experienced this. And again, if you're in the delivery of social care, what you really want is people to be kind, to be compassionate, to be empathetic. And those are the things we should be looking for when we're recruiting people. And we've touched on regulations, so I won't go over that, and boundaries and safeguarding. And we talk about buying and selling services to service users. This is not language you'll hear at Cornerstone, but that is what we talk about, and commissioners buy services. And again, this is really about being kind in local communities and delivering care and support in a very human way. And I just finish, because I'm sure I'm probably coming up to my 5 minutes, with a kindness story, a very brief one, because I like telling stories. When you're in the delivery of social care, and most of our work is commissioned by local authorities, we have a charitable purpose, of course, but we are contractually obliged to deliver certain things. And I met a lady in Irvine just recently, very serious mental health problems and a very troubled background. And her daughter, who she'd been estranged from for 30-odd years, the daughter had been taken into care, was getting married in America. And there's no way the mother whom we supported would be well enough to go. So my colleagues within this service, inverted commas, took her out to buy a mother of the bride outfit. They took her to a spa to have a manicure. They live streamed the wedding into her front room on the television. They all came to work that day, even the people who weren't scheduled to be at work, dressed in wedding outfits and kilts and fascinators. They put on a little buffet and some Prosecco. And for me, that's a real story of kindness, not just doing what you're contracted to do. And when the story was shared with me, the one thing the person telling me the story was worried about was that they'd breached the alcohol policy by having Prosecco at the wedding. I will finish there.
That's a fantastic story. I saw something coming around on Twitter about somebody's father had died, and at the funeral, the care home workers showed up. They weren't getting paid for it. It happened to my father-in-law's as well, and it really does make a difference. Now, you, young lady, had your hand up before. Would you like to tell everybody who you are and what you'd like to say?
Yes, I'm Sheila Young. I'm Director of Scotland for Home Start. So like Sarah, we rely very heavily on volunteers to do the work of supporting families, and there's an element of befriending in it. So I was really shocked, Stephen, when you said that a social security system that treated people with dignity and respect was somehow novel. I think that's what Attlee and Beveridge were inventing back in the day. And in 1977, as a very junior civil servant, I worked in the DHSS. I can honestly say we were both trained and encouraged to display a culture of kindness and to interpret the rules to the benefit of the clients. My God, that changed in 1979, and it's one of the reasons I moved on from that sector. But what is really cruel now, I think, in the system, and getting back to Julia's point about the design level is where the kindness needs to be, is the commissioning and tendering process. And when you talk about volunteers, I think that point about boundaries, some people are scared of just helping people, and they do like that slightly semi-formalised setup. But they have a relationship with the people who have trained and supported them, and they have a relationship, in our case, with the families they support, which is completely severed when you lose a contract. Now, I'm not saying we should hold on to contracts forever, but we're often looking at annual recommissioning. 3 years isn't actually very long. Those relationships are incredibly vital to Scotland. And we treat them as if they're nothing, because volunteers won't up sticks and just go to another organisation. Families that built up a relationship, why should on the 1st of April, the most vulnerable families in Scotland, create a relationship with somebody else? It's absolutely ridiculous. So the one plea I would have, and my question, I guess, is how can we move towards a fair system that doesn't leave contracts in the hands of people who are not doing good work, and allow some refreshing, but is on a longer time cycle, a human time cycle? Because right now, at local authority level, it's a mess.
Thank you very much. I'll come to Stephen's defence immediately about the comment on social security. I think probably what you were doing there was comparing that with what happens elsewhere right now on these islands,
right there.
rather than what anybody's intention was right off the bat. Do you want to just respond to that, and then I'm going to ask Julia for some comments, because you've been scribbling furiously and you've been very quiet for a while. So. Would you like to respond to Sheila?
Yeah, so absolutely, that's what I was referring to, and I think you understood that in terms of what you were saying about a certain period of time when things may have changed. What I would say is that I think the debate about cycles of funding often is considered from the financial perspective. And I don't hear, and it would be nice to hear, and I hope that some of the discussion that we begin to have in government as a consequence of some of the provocation is actually about the human impact of some of those changes, because I'm not sure we hear as strongly some of the messages that we need to hear about what that does then to service continuity and quality. And often what we hear is the kind of financial impact and the efficiency kind of questions. So there's something about taking a more rounded view about what the impact of this is, and I think that's something we need to hear.
Thank you. Julia, what are your reflections on what you've heard?
Well, what an amazing conversation, and what a shame we've got such a short time in this room. I want to end where I started, really, by saying I think this is really challenging and difficult, and there's a risk. We all have a slightly warm bath feeling of how we ought to be kind, and I've got two challenges back, which we won't have time to discuss, so bear with me. When we talk about our staff coming in on the days they're not paid and doing all these amazing things, there are people who will say they're being completely exploited and they have rights as workers, and I don't think they're wrong. I think there are real issues about our contractual relationships with our frontline staff, whether they're paid or volunteers. Actually, I mean, in one sense, it's that relationship building. We may have to think completely differently about how we employ people when we are asking them to do something different, and that's radical. And the second is the point I made, but I don't think as well as I should have done when I was speaking, is about fairness. Fairness is a huge driver in our public service and in the voluntary sector, and I'm really proud that it is, that we don't discriminate between people we like and those we don't. We don't discriminate on the basis of who fits in, who doesn't, how easy people are to be with, how much we love them. People get the same service. That's a huge challenge to this kindness agenda, which asks for autonomy and discretion, and I'm arguing passionately for. I think we need to really bear in mind that those are serious and legitimate challenges. There are some daft challenges, which I think we can dispense with, but those both seem to me very real, and I'm not sure we can have a service that is completely fair, completely transparent, and completely personal. And the risk is we're going to have to choose between those. And I think we need to think about that really seriously as a sector, because this is the sector I grew up in, and I really want to make sure we show the way on this.
Very important reflections there at the end. So we are out of time. We don't have to, I don't think anybody's coming into this room immediately. So what I'd like you to do, if you haven't got to go immediately, just to finish off, I asked you to turn to the person next to you about kindness. Do the same again and just reflect on how your perception of what you thought kindness was about in public policy when you came in the room has now perhaps changed a little bit based on what you've heard. If you need to go, you need to go, but if you want to take 5 minutes to do that, please do. And in the meantime, I shall play you a significant song for your as a background to your ruminations.